I knew something felt off the moment I stepped out of the coffee shop and saw those red and blue lights flashing against the wet pavement. I'd only walked a block before a squad car screeched to a halt beside me. The officer, stocky, mid-30s, crew cut, jumped out, barking for me to stop right there. Before I could even ask what was happening, he had my wrist twisted behind my back. "Easy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My tote bag slid from my shoulder and spilled across the sidewalk, tablet, folders, identification card case. Rainwater splattered the documents, but the officer didn't care. He shoved me against the cruiser, the chill of the metal seeping through my jacket. Pedestrians slowed, phones appearing in trembling hands. Someone called out, "Why are you manhandling her?" The officer's grip only tightened. I felt my heartbeat in my ears, louder than the traffic. He snapped on cuffs so tight the metal pinched my skin. "You match a description," he muttered. "Stay quiet." I drew a breath, collecting myself. "They don't know who you are," I reminded myself. Not yet. All I needed was one clear moment to show him. Across the street, a silver SUV pulled abruptly to the curb. Two suited men stepped out, eyes locked on me. Recognition flashed in their faces, and sudden alarm. One of them reached for his phone, urgency written in every line of his posture. The officer still hadn't noticed. "Sir," I said, voice low, calm. "Open my ID case. Please. You'll want to look." He sneered. "You don't give the orders." Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the shocked faces gathering around us. I closed my eyes for half a second, steadying my breathing. Because once that badge inside my torn-open case came into view, everything on this street was about to change. The suited men from the SUV were now jogging across the street, dodging traffic. One of them, tall, bald, and commanding, shouted, "Officer! Step away from her. Right now." The cop holding me glanced up, annoyed. "Back off. This is a law enforcement matter." "No," the bald man said firmly, holding up a federal ID. "It's not." The officer hesitated, blinking at the badge. Then his eyes darted to the other man, who flashed a second credential. People in the crowd gasped. "What the hell is going on?" the officer muttered. He looked down at the spilled contents of my tote bag, finally noticing the slim black case lying face up in the rain. He crouched down, snatched it up, and opened it. His face drained of color. There, gleaming under the clear plastic sleeve, was a federal law enforcement ID. My full name. Title. Agency crest. Classification. And a gold shield tucked inside, one few people in the city had ever seen outside a classified perimeter. He stepped back as if burned. "Ma'am, I didn't realize, obviously," I said coldly. One of the suited men stepped beside me and gently removed the cuffs from my wrists. "Agent Porter, are you all right?" I nodded slowly, rubbing the red welts around my wrists. "I'm fine. But this officer needs immediate suspension pending review." The crowd had gone completely silent. A woman with a phone held at chest level whispered, "She's an agent," another man said, "He cuffed a federal agent." The officer looked like he might be sick. I was told a suspect matching. I raised a hand. "Save it. You acted with zero cause and ignored clear signs. My credentials were visible, and you escalated without asking a single question." He looked down, rain dripping from his cap. One of the men from the SUV leaned in. "This is going to internal affairs." Across the street, more unmarked vehicles were pulling up, fast and deliberate. I turned toward the gathering crowd, eyes scanning the phones, the whispers, the disbelief. I hadn't asked for this attention, but now that it was here, I wouldn't shrink from it. Because what just happened couldn't be buried. Not this time. A sleek black vehicle rolled to a stop near the sidewalk. The rear door opened, and out stepped a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes. She wore a dark trench coat and moved with quiet authority. It was Deputy Director Marla Voss. The moment the officer saw her, he visibly stiffened. He must have recognized her from interagency briefings. She didn't show up in the field unless something serious had gone wrong. "Agent Porter," Voss said, stepping through the parting crowd. "I was briefed on the situation en route. Are you hurt?" "No injuries," I replied. But he ignored protocol, detained me without cause, and used unnecessary force. Voss turned toward the officer. "Name and badge number." "Now." He gave it without resistance, his voice flat and stunned. The two men from the SUV, my protective detail, who'd been following discreetly, stood by silently, letting the moment settle. Voss looked down at the officer's hands, still slightly trembling. "You have no idea," she said, her tone icy, "how fortunate you are that Agent Porter maintained control. You handcuffed a high-ranking federal operative in public, in front of witnesses and surveillance. You'll be lucky if this only ends with a review board." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing he could say. Behind us, the crowd remained rooted, now watching with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Some people were live streaming. One kid whispered, "She's not just an agent, she's the agent. The one from DC." I didn't react. Let them talk. It would only help the truth travel faster than the excuses. Voss turned to me. "Would you prefer to file your statement on site or back at the field office?" "Let's do it back at the office." But before we leave, I stepped toward the officer. He flinched. "This wasn't just about mistaken identity," I said evenly. "It was about assumption. Next time, check the facts before you reach for force." Then I walked away, the cuffs still wet in his hands, and stepped into the black vehicle that brought Director Voss. As the doors shut behind me, I glanced out at the stunned crowd, the flashing lights, the officer who now looked like a rookie surrounded by titans. And just like that, the narrative changed, because sometimes, the person you try to silence is exactly the one with the power to speak loudest. The ride back to the field office was silent at first. Just the soft hum of the engine and the low crackle of the radio. Voss sat across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't need to say much, her presence alone spoke volumes. "I'll handle the public statement," she finally said. "But Internal Affairs will want your report tonight." "Already writing it in my head," I replied, flexing my sore wrists. "I'll include every detail. Time-stamped." She nodded. "We've got at least 4 different angles of civilian footage. No need to chase witnesses, they're posting everything online." I looked out the window, watching the city blur past. "Good. Let them see what accountability looks like." "Do you want a press briefing?" she asked. I turned to her. "No. I don't want the attention. I just want this system to learn something from what happened." She studied me for a moment. "That's the difference between people like you and people like him." When we reached the building, security ushered us inside through the private entrance. I didn't need to flash my badge this time, every guard stood up straighter when I passed. Back in my office, I dropped my soaked tote on the floor and took a seat at my desk. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I started typing. I didn't just describe the physical actions, the way he shoved me, the metal cuffs biting into my skin, I described his eyes. His tone. His failure to assess before he acted. Because those were the details that revealed mindset, not just mistakes. By the time I hit save, I had 6 pages of testimony. I walked it straight to Internal Affairs. As I handed over the flash drive, the lead investigator looked up and said, "You know this is going to start waves, right?" "Good," I said. "Some departments need a tsunami." Later that night, as I sat at home nursing tea and watching the evening news, I saw the story already circulating. Undercover federal agent detained by local cop in public mistake. No names. Not yet. But I knew that would change. This wasn't about revenge. It was about precedent. Because if someone like me, armed with clearance, credentials, and composure, could be dragged down on a sidewalk without cause, what hope did anyone else have? That's why I wouldn't let it fade. Not this time. The next morning, the media storm hit like a freight train. Every major outlet ran the story, now confirmed with names and body cam footage. Headlines buzzed across the news cycle: federal agent mistakenly detained, public demands accountability. Body cam footage sparks outrage as high-ranking operative manhandled without cause. Agency confirms, local officer ignored protocol, suspended pending investigation. I stayed off the grid. No interviews. No statements. I let the truth do the talking. The video clips alone were damning: the officer's aggressive approach, the clear sight of my credentials on the ground, the visible panic when my identity was revealed. People didn't need commentary. They saw everything. By noon, I got a call from Deputy Director Voss. "Thought you'd want to know," she said. "Mayor's office just issued an apology. The police chief went on record supporting the investigation." "And the officer?" I asked. "On administrative leave. Pending disciplinary review. But unofficially, his career's iced." I leaned back in my chair. "That was fast." Voss chuckled. "Not really. That was justice trying to catch up." Before we hung up, she added, "We're also receiving calls from legal groups, civil organizations. They want to connect with you." "I'm not interested in speeches or rallies," I said. "This isn't about me." "No," she agreed. "It's about what could have happened if you weren't who you are." I didn't respond. Because that part haunted me too. What if I didn't have a badge? What if I hadn't been calm? What if those men in the SUV didn't arrive when they did? That wasn't fear talking, it was realism. It was understanding how close this came to being a tragedy instead of a scandal. I looked over at the framed photo on my desk: my parents on graduation day, both former agents themselves, proud and beaming. They taught me never to misuse my authority. But they also taught me never to let someone else get away with misusing theirs. So I stayed quiet, stayed focused, and prepared for the next step, because this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something bigger. 3 days later, I was called into a closed-door meeting at the regional field office. The conference room was filled with brass, internal affairs, senior agency counsel, and a representative from the Department of Justice. No press, no outside cameras, just cold water bottles and folders thick with printed statements, transcripts, and frame-by-frame footage. Deputy Director Voss led the session. "We're here to determine the formal recommendations stemming from Agent Porter's unlawful detention," she began. "This is not a symbolic review. It's procedural, actionable, and on the record." They asked me to walk through it again, and I did: precise, measured, no embellishments. Just facts. After I finished, the DOJ rep leaned forward. "Agent Porter, would you be willing to appear before a federal oversight committee? To testify on how local enforcement failures risk operational integrity for field agents nationwide?" I looked him in the eye. "Yes. If it helps stop this from happening again, to any agent, to any citizen, I'll be there." A murmur of approval passed around the room. Then the Internal Affairs Director opened a separate file. "There's more. The officer involved, Daniel Wexler, has a pattern. 2 prior complaints from civilians about unnecessary escalation. No suspensions. Just retraining and write-ups." The room went still. Voss's expression hardened. "Why wasn't that flagged before this?" "Local PD kept it internal," came the quiet reply. "No one escalated it." I spoke up. "And now he escalated on someone who could escalate back. No one disagreed. By the end of the meeting, the decision was clear: Officer Wexler's case would be referred to the State Disciplinary Board. A joint agency training initiative would be proposed to prevent misidentification of undercover operatives. And I would speak before the oversight panel in Washington within the month. As I left the room, Voss caught up with me in the hallway. "You handled this better than most would have," she said. "And now your voice is louder than you probably ever wanted." I gave a faint smile. "Let's make sure it says something that matters." Outside, the sky was overcast, but for the first time in days, I didn't feel the weight of it pressing down. This wasn't just about what had happened on that rainy sidewalk anymore. It was about what would happen next, nationwide. 2 weeks later, I found myself in a tall, echoing chamber on Capitol Hill, seated behind a polished oak desk with a microphone in front of me. The Oversight Committee hearing room was packed: lawmakers, aides, reporters, cameras. A quiet tension filled the space. I was sworn in, then introduced. The committee chair, a seasoned senator with tired eyes and a sharp mind, gestured for me to begin. "Agent Porter," he said, "you have the floor." I adjusted the mic and looked directly into the room. "My name is Cassandra Porter. I serve as a federal field agent for the U.S. Department of Intelligence Operations. I've led joint task forces in 4 states, briefed cabinet members, and trained law enforcement across jurisdictions. I carry one of the highest security clearances in this region." I paused, then continued. "Despite all that, I was pinned against a police cruiser by an officer who never asked for my name. He ignored the visible ID case I carried, escalated without cause, and detained me on a public street with force." The room stayed silent. And the only thing that stopped it from becoming something far worse, was the arrival of a Federal Protection Unit who knew who I was. Not everyone gets that kind of backup. Most people don't. A few lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not here to destroy local law enforcement," I said. "I've worked alongside great officers, brave, smart, restrained. But this wasn't about one mistake. This was about a broken pattern. A failure to observe, to verify, to ask questions before acting on assumption." I held up a printout of the officer's incident report, 2 pages, mostly blank. This was his entire justification. 2 vague lines and a checkmark under "reasonable suspicion." That's all it took to detain a federal agent. The senator leaned forward. "What would you recommend this committee prioritize?" I answered without hesitation. "Mandatory cross-agency recognition protocols. Bodycam footage audits tied to training history. And stronger disciplinary action for repeat violations, before someone ends up harmed, not after." There were murmurs. Nods. A few scribbled notes. But what I saw in their eyes was more than that. They believed me. And they knew that if it could happen to someone like me, it could happen to anyone. When I finished, the room applauded, not out of ceremony, but out of shared realization. The hearing wasn't the end. It was ignition. By the next morning, my testimony was everywhere. Clips from the hearing dominated news cycles, edited, dissected, debated. The full version had already gone viral. Not because I raised my voice or delivered some fiery speech, but because I spoke plainly. Honestly. From experience. Agent Porter's words cut through the noise. A federal operative reveals a deeper failure in street-level accountability. This wasn't just about one mistake, this was about a system built on assumption. Even agencies that usually avoided public discussion began issuing statements. Departments across the country initiated internal reviews. Some quietly pulled officers from the street for retraining. Others started reaching out directly, asking if I'd help build new joint recognition protocols. Meanwhile, the officer, Wexler, was officially dismissed. The police union tried to shield him, claiming he acted under stress, but the combination of prior complaints, public pressure, and bodycam footage made it clear, no one was buying the excuses anymore. Still, I wasn't celebrating. I hadn't done any of this for applause. I did it because silence was no longer an option. I had worn a badge for 12 years. I knew what the oath meant, and I knew how dangerous it was when people forgot it. Late one night, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a single envelope and a letter. No return name, no sender. The letter read, Agent Porter, I was there that day. I was one of the bystanders. I didn't speak up in the moment, and I've thought about that every night since. Watching you testify gave me the words I didn't have then. Thank you for not staying quiet, LC. It hit me harder than I expected. Because it reminded me this wasn't just a story of justice. It was a story of awakening. Some were waking up to the consequences of unchecked power. Others were waking up to their own responsibility to speak. And me? I was wide awake now, with a louder voice than ever before. And I wasn't done yet. A month later, I was back in the field, briefing a regional task force in Atlanta on new interagency recognition procedures. It wasn't glamorous work. No cameras. No press. Just a dozen officers, detectives, and agents in folding chairs, sipping coffee and listening as I explained the new protocols designed to prevent what happened to me from happening again. Every agent in plain clothes, I said, pointing to the projected slide, will now carry a secondary digital ID embedded in their phones. It syncs with an encrypted law enforcement database accessible via dispatch. You'll have their identity verified in under 60 seconds. No more guesses. An older sergeant in the back raised his hand. What if the agent's in deep cover and doesn't respond? Then you don't escalate, I said. You radio it in, follow procedure, and wait for verification. You don't cuff anyone just because they fit a vague profile. He nodded slowly. Others took notes. After the session ended, a young female officer approached me quietly. I just wanted to say. I watched your testimony, she said. It changed how I patrol. I don't assume anymore. I observe. That mattered. More than headlines. More than apologies. That was change. Later that evening, I sat in my hotel room flipping through agency emails when one subject line caught my eye: invitation, National Policy Forum on Civil-Military Cooperation, keynote speaker request. I opened it. They wanted me to speak. Not just as a field agent, but as someone who had lived through the consequences of poor coordination and emerged determined to fix it. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. I thought about the sidewalk. The cold cuffs. The silence before the truth shattered the moment. Then I hit reply. Confirmed. I'll be there. Because this story, my story, wasn't about what happened to me anymore. It was about who listened, what changed, and how many more people would never have to experience it because someone finally stood up and said. The National Policy Forum was held in a marble-walled hall overlooking the Potomac. Rows of uniforms and suits filled the audience: commanders, legislators, federal directors, state officials. The kind of crowd that didn't flinch easily. But when I stepped onto that stage, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I took a deep breath and looked out over them, remembering that rainy day, the flash of red and blue lights, the sound of cuffs closing around my wrists. And I remembered what came after, the silence that didn't last, because I refused to let it. I leaned into the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, I'm not here to tell you a story of victimhood. I'm here to tell you a story of failure, and response. The room was silent. One officer made a reckless decision. But what truly matters is what came next, the accountability, the conversations, the reforms. You're not defined by your mistakes. You're defined by what you do after them. I spoke about policy, about procedure, but also about culture, the subtle assumptions that creep into institutions, the dangers of unchecked certainty, and the need for empathy and training. I ended with this: I was lucky. I had the badge, the credentials, the backup. But most people don't. If we build a system that protects only those who wear titles, we've missed the point entirely. We're here to protect everyone. Without bias. Without exception. When I stepped down from the podium, the room stood. Not just out of formality. Out of recognition. Later, as I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, a younger agent stopped me on the steps. "Agent Porter," he said, "what happened to you? It changed this department. People are watching how we treat others now. We're thinking twice." I gave a small nod. "Good," I said. "Then it was worth it." I didn't ask for what happened. But I answered it. Loudly. With action. With truth. Because sometimes, the most powerful identity you can carry, is the one you reveal when the world tries to silence you.